What's up, Clash Bros? Thank you guys for coming back for another video. Today we are going to look over the top 5 most used decks in Clash Royale history. You have either used or gone up against these decks. You may even hate some of these decks. Now, over the past year that Clash Royale has been out, these decks have had little changes to adapt to the meta, updates, buffs, and nerfs. They might not be the same exact decks from when they were first made. I looked over the last year of information of what players have used in the top 100 and my experience in the game as well over that time. This is a list of my opinion and research. If you think I missed a deck or one of these decks shouldn't be on the list, let me know in the comments. Let's look over the top 5 most popular decks in the game. Coming in at number 5 is a Lava Hound Beatdown. Just like most of the decks on this list, many of the cards can be rotated out according to the cards you may not have or the current meta. But the core cards of this deck that is important is of course a Lava Hound, Mega Minion, and Miner. The following cards can be adjusted: Tombstone, Lightning, Baby Dragon, the Log, and Lumberjack. Coming in at an average elixir cost of 4 elixir. Lava Hound is a tank of the deck, and the deck revolves around getting the Lava Hound to the tower with your other low-cost cards to back it up and clean up any of the opponent's troops. This deck is all about managing elixir, making sure you are staying in the rotation of the cards you want and not your opponent's. When using this deck, you want to try to avoid using the Lava Hound before W elixir. This is when the deck really starts to shine, allowing you to take over your enemy by sending everything you have at them, negating their pushes with your backup cards, and pushing hard enough to actually 3-crown your opponent. If your opponent has a defense such as an Inferno Tower, you have the Lightning to hit the Inferno Tower plus 2 other cards or a tower. Miner makes a great distraction card, allowing you to force your opponent to deal with what is coming at their tower along with already what is on their tower. Since most Lava Hound decks don't have a defense, not allowing your opponent to build up a strong push is vital to your defense. Lightning any pushes along with laying down your Tombstone, slowing down your opponent's pushing till your remaining troops have time to clean up. This is a deck that even if you are a tower down, you do not need to stress. This deck can turn the tides in just a few cards, but not getting caught without elixir and staying in a good card rotation, you will always have a fighting chance. This deck has been popular since the release of the Lava Hound, and it is not very difficult to play. The simplicity of the offensive attack is a bright side of this deck, but if defending your towers is difficult, then that's where this deck starts to chip at your armor. If you don't have the Lava Hound yet, I would find a good counter deck, because this deck is here to stay. Lava Hound Beatdown deck comes in at number 5. The Royal Giant deck comes in at number 4 for being the most popular deck since the beginning of Clash Royale. This has to be one of the most hated decks in the game, maybe even more than the Expo deck that first started the rage against certain cards in the game. But because it is so simple to play, this deck seems to be used by everyone. Now, the Royal Giant deck has gone through many phases and many cards can be rotated out. Really, the most important card is the Royal Giant. But this deck also has a Furnace, Mega Minion, Archers, the Log, Inferno Tower, Skeleton Army, and Fire Spirits, coming in at an average elixir cost of 3.5. There are so many ways to play the Royal Giant. Some people like starting him in the back to get a giant push on their enemy. Or some people like starting him at the bridge after their opponent is low on elixir to catch them off guard. Whatever your game plan is, your opponent better have a better plan. Because the Royal Giant has to be the simplest offensive card to lay down. Just 1 click and 3 steps and the Royal Giant has already taken shots at your enemy's tower, giving your opponent less than 2 seconds to react and make a play. Depending on your supporting troops, the Royal Giant tanks the damage from your enemy's tower while they come up and defend the Royal Giant and make their way to your opponent's tower. This specific Royal Giant deck is also good for defending your towers. The Inferno Tower is my favorite defense and is a must if I am using a Royal Giant deck. It is the best for any enemy tankers and any other pushes your opponent may have, even a Hog Rider. And if your opponent happens to have the Inferno Tower as well, having a zap in your deck to restart the Inferno Tower is a great play. But that won't be the only play you will have to do. You will have to lay down additional backup troops to help the Royal Giant out. You may have a lot of health, but not as much as most tanks in the game. Backing them up is very important. If you are having trouble and have plateaued in your trophy pushing using other decks, practicing this deck and getting good with it may give you that push you need to get over that hump. but it definitely won't make you any friends along the way. Even though the Royal Giant is considered the cancer of Clash Royale and maybe one of the most hated cards in the game, it is still a card in the game and it will be used by a lot of players. So if you can't learn to beat them, join them. Royal Giant deck comes in at number 4 on my list. Miner Control comes in at number 3. The Miner is an interesting card. It doesn't do a lot of damage. If someone sends a lone miner to my tower, I actually ignore it, seeing that it only does around 400 damage by itself. But yet, this card is used in many decks. That is because of the health and the easy distraction that it causes. Now, the miner deck that has been the most popular over the last few months has changed due to recent update changes. But the miner mini P.E.K.K.A deck had its time to shine for a brief period of time. This deck has an average elixir cost of 3.6. The miner is one of the most versatile cards in the game. He is great on offensive for chip damage and distraction, and used on defense to pull your enemy's troops away from your tower. When using this deck, you will want to play very defensively until you figured out your enemy's deck and strategy. Your main damage dealers will be your mini P.E.K.K.A and minion horde, with princess and guards good at doing chip damage as well. In the first 2 minutes of game, you'll want to play very passive, not making many pushes. Instead, you'll want to focus on making positive elixir trades with your princess and guards, making smaller counter pushes, while placing down your elixir pump when the time is right. In double elixir time, you'll want to start adding the pressure, with the miner and mini P.E.K.K.A being the main push of the deck, using your zap to take out any small troops that may take the focus away from the tower for your mini P.E.K.K.A. Now, this deck is probably the most difficult deck to play on this list because of the low elixir troops, and defense is this deck's weakness. But it's a fun and exciting deck to play because of the high action of always being able to place down cards. Miner Control deck coming in at the number 3 spot. Hog Trifecta coming in at number 2. Now, what can I say about this deck? Hog Trifecta could be debated as the most popular deck to ever hit Clash Royale, but by the information that I looked through, this deck comes in second place. This deck gained its popularity not only because it's one of the most effective decks in all arenas, but it does not contain a single legendary, which means a larger percentage of the community is able to use this deck. And maybe because of the fact that the cannon was nerfed, which is why we saw a dip in its use the last few months, but has made a resurgence over the last month. This was the original Hog Trifecta deck that came in at 3.5 elixir, which in my opinion is not a usable deck anymore. But this version of the Hog Trifecta is starting to cause ripples in the community again. You have most likely seen this deck, maybe even today if you've been playing. This deck has an average elixir cost of 3.8. It still has a magnificent trio, Hog Rider, Valkyrie, and the Musketeer. It also has one of my favorite defenses in the game, Inferno Tower. Able to defend against heavy tankers, this deck is all about attacking though. Cycling through your cards to keep the pressure on your opponent, placing a combination of Ice Golem, Valkyrie, Hog Rider, and then Musketeer, making a very tough push to stop with plenty of support. The weakness of this deck is definitely its defense, especially against air troops. But once you get the hang of this deck, you're able to keep the pushing so fast that your opponent won't have time to build up a push of his own. It will spend his whole time defending. Let's all give it up to one of the few decks in the game that has no legendaries, but yet is still very effective. So let's all thank the Clash Royale gods by allowing the Hog Trifecta to make a comeback. Hog Trifecta deck will always have a special place in my heart, but it does come in at the number 2 spot. Before we get into the number 1 spot, let's give some runner-up mentions to decks that just barely missed the list. Hog Freeze, a great deck that had a brief time to shine. Before many of the new legendaries came into the game, this was a fan favorite because you didn't need a legendary. But before this deck got out of control, Supercell nerfed the freeze spell, making this deck only have a small amount of time in the meta. 3 Muskie deck. Another great deck that is very frustrating to play against, but maybe as frustrating to play, because of the risk of falling too low on elixir and your opponent capitalizing on your mistakes. Even though great players make this deck look easy to play, it's really not. Maybe that is why not as many players use this deck. The Fireball might have something to do with that as well. This deck still has plenty of players using it, but just not enough to knock any of these other decks off this list. Hog Cycle. This deck was very popular just a few months ago and could have easily made this list. But then again, this list could have been made of just all Hog Rider decks. So I decided to only pick the most popular Hog deck to add to this list. This deck is a lot of fun to play because of the low average elixir cost. You are always able to be playing cards, making for never a dull moment. The defense on this deck is its major weakness, but that is not what made this deck start to fall off the meta. Now that I think about it, it wasn't until Supercell took away one of the skeletons in the skeleton card, making only 3 spawn. How crazy is that? Taking away 1 skeleton out of this deck pushed this deck out of the meta. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm going to pretend that it is. Golem Beatdown, one of the best heavy tanker decks to play. The learning curve is easier on this deck in my opinion, but just like the 3 Muskie deck, it is very easy to get caught off guard with no elixir, making for experienced players to take advantage of your mistakes. But this is a deck that we may never see completely disappear from the meta. The cards around the Golem might change, but the Golem is here to stay. Plus, the Golem is superior over the P.E.K.K.A. Now it's time to reveal the #1 most popular deck in the game of Clash Royale since its release. Leave in the comments right now what you think it might be. And don't cheat. Guess what it is right now and see if you are right. Many of you might not get this, few of you might, but once I reveal it, it will be a no-brainer. We have seen this deck since the start of the game. It might have even been one of the first meta decks in the game, and it is still here almost 1 year later. The #1 most popular deck in the game of Clash Royale is... Giant Beatdown. Yes, the Giant Beatdown deck comes in at #1. Overall, the entire time Clash Royale has been around, the Giant Beatdown deck is by far the most popular deck in the game. And you see this deck used from Arena 1 to Arena 10. When I averaged out all the decks in the game, it more than doubled the amount of uses in the next closest deck. Now, there are many different variations of how this deck can be used. From the start of Clash Royale using Giant, Witch, Musketeer, and Valkyrie, to now where you have Giant, Bull, or Miner, the Giant is a great card, both on offense and defense, being a great meat shield for your tower or troops. And it is one of the easiest cards to play. The Giant Beatdown deck may change the cards around, but the Giant will always be used. He has been one of the fan favorites in Clash of Clans and is still a fan favorite in Clash Royale. Let's give thanks to the Giant. He has taken a lot of death for all of us over the years. There is no way I could give the #1 spot to any other deck. The Giant Beatdown deck might not be the most effective deck in the game, but it is definitely the most popular deck in the game. The Giant Beatdown deck comes in at #1 of being the most popular deck in Clash Royale history. What do you guys think of my list? Did I leave off a deck you think should have been on this list? Is there a deck on this list that shouldn't even be on it? Let me know in the comments below. What list should I make next? Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Can we smash 200 likes on this video? Make sure to subscribe and join the Clash Bro family. Hope you guys have a great day. And don't forget, my Clash Bros, to stay beautiful.
Make it drop, honey.